Hello and welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is Matt.
And my name is James.
And this week on the podcast in our time travel series, we're looking at the concept of doubles. We've taken two films where characters have to face off against themselves because of a time travel loop that's brought them face to face with a body double. The first film that we're looking at this week to explore that is Looper from 2012, directed by Rian Johnson. And the second film is Timecrimes, Los Cronocriminales from 2007, directed by Nacho Vigalondo. One of these films is going to take the characters and have them coming face to face with each other after a big time gap. That's Looper. And then the other one brings the character back to himself on a much smaller scale. But in both films, they're facing off with like a body double, time traveling duplicate of themselves. And those characters are at odds with each other.
And they both got sort of criminal elements in there as well. I mean, Timecrimes is obvious. The film's called Timecrimes, but both of them have sort of like, there's sort of like a shady undercurrent of what's going on.
Yeah, we've looked at law enforcers who are time travelers, so that obviously touched on some of the criminal element, but these two films really focus on that criminal element as the main characters. So should we get straight into Looper for the first one of them and look at the criminal element in that film?
Sounds good to me.
In the future, time travel is outlawed, used only in secret by the largest criminal organizations. When they need someone gone and they want to erase any trace of the target ever existing, they use specialized assassins like me, called loopers.
So Looper from 2012, directed by Rian Johnson. This was a pretty huge sci-fi hit, I think, when it came out. Is that fair to say? Rian Johnson was a bit of an indie darling and then got his big budget, and Looper was his first hit with that studio backing behind it. Do you remember this film when it came out?
Yeah, I remember there was like a big hoo-ha about the fact that Joseph Gordon-Levitt had loads of prosthetics to make him look like a young Bruce Willis, which was like, it was all over the news. It was this big sort of like drawing point for Looper itself. And I don't know how successful that is in the film. I'm sure we'll get into that. But it was like an interesting thing because it's got two actors which are both sort of like, they're both very well known, aren't they? Like Bruce Willis, obviously, we've talked about him in 12 Monkeys. Everybody knows who Bruce Willis is. And Joseph Gordon-Levitt was sort of like really on the rise, like around about 2012. He'd done quite a few other things. He'd done Brick with Rian Johnson previously. And I think there was another film he was in as well. I can't remember it off the top of my head.
He's in Inception, isn't he? That was before this one.
Yeah, he was like Inception, obviously. And but there was another Rian Johnson one specifically, but I can't think of what it was called.
Well, he was in Third Rock from the Sun, James, lest we forget, classic sci-fi comedy. He was Tommy from that.
Exactly, and look at him now. He's doing all the big budget films.
Yeah, I do remember this hoo-ha that you mentioned now that you mention it. Because it's so big, I think the pictures came out quite a long time before the film and people kind of got a glimpse of the makeup, knowing that he was playing a young Bruce Willis. And I mean, I think that the fuss of that came because he looks pretty silly, I think. Is that fair to say? It's just...
Yeah, let's be honest. Like when you look at just his surface, like the surface appearance of the prosthetics and stuff, it doesn't look exactly like it's supposed to, because we've seen a young Bruce Willis. We know what a young Bruce Willis looks like. And also casting Joseph Gordon-Levitt, he looks completely different to Bruce Willis just in general. So, but in his performance, I think he does do a good job in sort of like nailing Bruce Willis's mannerisms and things like that. But obviously when you see those press shots back in 2012, before the films like properly come out, you're a bit dubious about how it's going to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a dead-on Bruce Willis impression that he's doing. I do think, unfortunately, the makeup might take away from that performance a little bit. Because like you said, he's got Bruce Willis's mannerisms and inflection like dead on. Because Bruce Willis, as much as I love him, I don't know if I said this when we watched 12 Monkeys, but as far as I'm concerned, Bruce Willis kind of just does the exact same performance in every single film he's in. And he's great and I love it and he can get away with that. But I think there's no denying that he's just doing like one performance every time, and Joseph Gordon-Levitt nails it. And yeah, the makeup, I think, kind of distracts from that a little bit.
Yeah, but he's definitely sort of like, he's into that role. He is sort of like embodying Bruce Willis, who is obviously the biggest star in this film as well. So it's more sort of like him having to be Bruce Willis than rather like if there was another actor who was playing the older version of Joseph Gordon-Levitt, which could have been an option. But they went for that big star power of having Bruce Willis in the film.
Yeah, which is slightly unfair on Joseph Gordon-Levitt because he's got to do kind of double the effort of putting in a good performance while also having to just adapt his performance to just be like a Bruce Willis performance, basically.
And what do you think of Rian Johnson as a director? Like, he's done Knives Out. I spoke about Brick a minute ago. He did The Last Jedi, which I know, well, like, we both really liked The Last Jedi from what I remember, compared to the sequel after that. And he's done a lot of different kind of like things, but there's been this, I mean, with Knives Out and Brick, there's a definite sort of like noir element to it. It's got the detective stories in both of those. It's all that kind of stuff going on there. What do you think about like his past work?
I saw Brick when it first came out, and I really, really enjoyed it, but I've never rewatched it. I don't know how well it holds up. And then Looper was the next thing I saw by him, and I was really, really disappointed by Looper when I saw it at the cinema. I really didn't like it. And then I saw Last Jedi. I can't remember if we talked about this when we talked about Skywalker, but I left Last Jedi for like almost a year, I think, after it came out. I just wasn't fussed. And by the time I saw it, the polarized dialogue on the internet about it, I was just like, that was all right. Like I didn't hate it and I didn't love it. And I kind of assumed I would feel one of those emotions based on how people on Twitter reacted to it. And I just thought it was like kind of okay. I did think he did some really interesting things with the characters and what he was trying to do with Star Wars that were ultimately just sort of dumped in a ditch for the third film. And that was a big problem for me. But yeah, I've heard Knives Out is really good. I don't know if I need to check that out to kind of solidify my opinion of Rian Johnson.
Yeah, I really enjoyed Knives Out, actually. You have got Daniel Craig doing his best Foghorn Leghorn impression, which is worth seeing just for that alone. Like, it's good. I mean, from the sounds of it, you're not a massive fan of a lot of Rian Johnson's previous films, but I would say go into Knives Out of an open mind, because it's like, if you like those kind of sort of like murder mystery kind of storylines, it's like, it's enjoyable. At least I found it enjoyable. It was a good watch.
All right, nice. Okay, you've sold me. I'll check it out. But let's talk about Looper then. And let's talk about should we get started with the overall setup of the time travel that's going on that forms the backdrop of Looper, and I guess what a looper is?
Yeah, so one of the first things I found interesting about this and about the time travel is that it's set in a near future. A lot of the films we've seen previously they've had some sort of like present, which is like our present, and it's definitely our present. Whereas in this, the first year you're shown is 2044, and it's a dystopian future. It's got that element to it straight off the bat. And then the time travel apparently is invented like 30 years in the future, I think. So it's like 2074 is when time travel is being used and is outlawed. So already you've got this dystopian society in present day 2044, and then you've got time travel coming into it from 2074. So yeah, so where does it go from there, Matt?
Yeah, so well, you've got these two sci-fi elements. I hadn't really thought about the dystopian element as being such a big focus, but it is interesting because also on top of that, you've got the TKs, the telekinetic people, who are just sort of casually mentioned at the start of the film because Joe's mate can levitate coins. But we'll come back to that. Anyway, where we go from there is Joe is a looper who is an assassin who is just paid to shoot people in a field. So this time travel is invented in the future. And I want to talk about this because this is like the first thing that really annoyed me about the film and still really annoys me about the film. In the future, the criminals who monopolize time travel, which is an illegal technology, use it to dispose of a body. Because it is very, very, very hard to get rid of a body in the future because of tracking technology, which is not explained any further than that. Fine, you can use your imagination. but they can't get rid of a dead body because of this tracking technology, but they can take a live body to a time machine, put it in the time machine, and then it disappears. And that is not a problem for this tracking technology that prevents them from killing everyone, which really bothered me both times I've seen the film. I just don't understand how they can get away with that, but they can't kill people. But they send them back, and then people like Joe shoot them in a field in 2044, and then they can dump the body in the furnace, and problem solved. Your rival criminal or whoever is disposed from 2074, murdered in the past. No one's the wiser in 2074, and Joe gets paid. And that's the premise of the film and of a looper as a person, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a weird concept, isn't it? So they're basically saying that if they dispose of the bodies in 2044 in the past, then the body technically doesn't exist yet in the future.
Or it's not the same body, and it won't matter, because even if they're old enough to be alive in 2044, they're still alive in 2044, so there's no suspicion if the body was ever found. I think that's what they say.
Yeah. So what was your main sort of like qualm with that then? Was it the idea of the tracking system not being able to work, or where
you can't get rid of a corpse because of the tracking system, but a body can disappear into the past?
Surely that's going to ring off a few alarm bells, isn't it? If there's like if you're tracking a body continuously, and then suddenly it disappears, then you know that it's been disposed of somewhere.
Or you can go and look at that place where the body last was, and there'll be a fucking time machine there. And then you can shut that down because time travel's illegal. Problem solved. No more mob control of murder.
Time travel shit just fries your brain like an egg. Why the fuck French?
I'm going to France.
You should go to China.
I'm going to France.
I'm from the future. You should go to China.
I'm going to France.
You're going.
I mean, we don't really get much of a glimpse of 2074, do we? We don't see much of what's happening. You do get a flashback with Bruce Willis, which we'll go into, but you're not told too much about it. And I think that's deliberate, because obviously if you think too much about the time travel in this film, it starts to fall apart a bit, doesn't it?
Well, that's what I thought when I first saw it, and that's what really bothered me. I was interested watching it again that the things that bother me are not so much the time travel elements, although I do think the time travel is a bit ropey, but it's stuff like that this tracking technology doesn't extend as far as a body disappearing into the past. But let's talk a bit more about how loopers work as well, because there's more there that really, really gets up my nose.
So tell me, Matt.
So that's the basics of the loopers. They're assassins who get rid of bodies from the future. And then we are introduced to this concept of closing your loop. So the mob in the future doesn't want any connection to the loopers. So they track them down in 2074 if they're still alive, and send them back to themselves in the past, where they kill their future selves. They get a massive payout, and they no longer have to work as a looper. And that's called closing your loop. Now, James, if you were a mob boss in 2074, why would you send old Joe, for example, back to young Joe to be killed, when you have an entire network of loopers who kill strangers from the future and don't even look at their faces, don't even take the hood off them? Why not just send them back to each other? They don't need to know that they've killed themselves. It
is weirdly specific, isn't it?
Yeah, and it seems just set up to fail. Like, exactly as it plays out in the film, someone's going to see themselves and freak out and not do it, and then cause chronological discrepancies and break the timeline. It just really, really badly set up by the mob here.
Yeah, because when they do sort of like, when they meet their future selves in that final loop, when they're closing their loop, their future selves has loads of like gold bars strapped to their backs, don't they?
Yeah.
And that's their sort of like final payoff. Like, your job's done now. Here's loads of money. You can go off, live the life you want. You don't need to worry about being a looper anymore, because you're a made man now.
Yeah. But you see the gold, and that's how you know that it was yourself that you just killed, and all the loopers know that.
Yeah, but why not have somebody else, like another, like just your loop's closed, someone else has closed your loop, a different hitman.
Yeah.
And then just send the gold back on a different body if you want, or just send the gold back afterwards.
Don't send the gold back, save yourself some gold.
Just be like, oh, we closed your loop. You don't even have to tell them you've closed their loop.
No, of course you don't. That's what I'm saying. Why introduce this element of risk? Like, it's just, Where's the operational security here, James? How are you running your mafia in 2074?
I can see your future mafia is going to work much better, Matt.
I just wanted to get all of that off my chest because it still really bothered me. And that made me really hate the film when I first saw it because I couldn't stop thinking about it. I will say that rewatching it, it's really, really slick. It's really well made. And after you get past all of that nonsense at the beginning, it's hard not to like the film, or it was for me anyway.
That's good. I'm glad you didn't have too much of a painful experience revisiting this film then. So obviously, we talked about like that, closing the loop, and then when you retire someone. So the main sort of like big plot point of this film is when Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who is young Joe, meets his older self. And this is like you said, he's in a field, his next victim pops up, it's Bruce Willis, it's an older version of him, he's got no hood, so he knows exactly who he is, and he knows that it's now time to close his loop. So there's one thing I want to talk about before we get into this moment. So prior to that, you see Joe's mate, who has also just closed his loop, but then he was in a predicament where he didn't close his loop because he let the guy run away. And the way that they kill that guy is quite interesting. So what did you think about that? Because it's time cop rules again, isn't it? So
yeah, so it's Seth is his friend, isn't it? So they have to they need to track down old Seth because old Seth is the unclosed loop. What do they call it? They've got a term for when you don't letting your loop run. That is it?
Yeah, I think so.
So Seth's let his loop run. They want to track down old Seth or loop Seth or whatever they call him and just kill him because that closes the loop and it solves all their problems. But rather than organise a big manhunt, I did quite like this. They just grab Seth and start chopping bits off him. And then old Seth, and they carve like directions into his arm so that he's got a message and says, "You got to come here." And then they're just chopping off his leg, his nose. I think his arms go at one point.
I thought that was a really good use of that sort of time travel trope that if you do something to your past self, then your future self will feel it. And like the whole thing, like we said, time cop rules, if you get a scar in the past, it will appear on your future self. So like carving messages into your past self's arm to sort of like, because the mob do that to say like, get to this place at this time, or you know what's going to happen basically. And yeah, the whole sort of like torture sequence, which is happening on both sides, because you don't see what's happening to present day Seth, but you can see older Seth, like you said, with like having his nose chopped off and his arms chopped off. And then when he finally gets there, you can see that the younger Seth, but you don't see him clearly. You just see him sort of like on a hospital bed or something like that. And there's like surgeons around him. So you don't know if he's sort of like, so he's not being tortured in the way that you would imagine. Because when I first saw that scene, I was kind of imagining a crazy torture scene with the past Seth, with the present Seth. But they're being quite surgical about it, aren't they?
Yeah, they've got him knocked out so they can just do whatever they want to him. But presumably Seth is alive at the end of that scene and is then kept alive for 30 years?
Yeah, because if not, then it wouldn't have had an impact on the older Seth, would it?
And that they just move away from Seth, but we're going to come back to that at the end of the movie. And what happens to Seth next, I think, is an interesting question for how the rest of the movie works, and certainly the end of the film. But we can come back to that, I think.
So going back to the moment when Joe meets old Joe, at this point you're sort of like, you're starting the jeopardy in it. Like, you know that younger Joe has to kill old Joe or it's all gonna unravel. He needs to sort of like close his loop and get his payoff, and then he can go off into the sunset with all his money. So at this point we've been following younger Joe throughout the whole first half of the film and sort of like his story. And then there's a moment when we flip to older Joe. So we see Bruce Willis's side of the story. So what did you think about sort of like that and sort of seeing that alternate timeline of what would have happened if young Joe had killed old Joe in the first place?
Yeah, because it just jumps back and in the very first instance of seeing the film, it's not immediately clear that you'll see it. That's Bruce Willis as old Joe 30 years prior. It just repeats the events of young Joe seeing himself. But in that version, Bruce Willis had the hood on and he just killed him immediately, did what he was supposed to do. That is the best sequence in the film, I thought. It's a 30-year montage of, like you said, Joe getting his money, and going off into the sunset. It all goes horribly wrong. He's, we know he's addicted to drugs already, and he continues to be addicted to those drugs, goes to Shanghai, spends all of that money within a few years, and then just goes back into a life of crime and basically becomes a gangster in Shanghai. And we see this kind of degrading person of Joseph Gordon-Levitt over the years, and it transitions to Bruce Willis. But then the montage goes on and he meets a woman, falls in love, happily ever after, and that's when he gets scooped up by the Gap men to be sent back to have his loop closed. So we get this what is it? It's probably less than 10 minutes, isn't it, of just a montage of how Bruce Willis came to rail against the looping system and want to do things differently.
But you're right, it's such a memorable part of the film, even if it is like 10 minutes long. It's one of the things that you remember very vividly because you're shown this entire life in the space of a montage, and you see him sort of growing old, like you said. And I found that whole bit really powerful because you can see what it could have been like, and you're constantly thinking, because you need to have that sort of connection to older Joe in order to sort of feel for his storyline and sort of want to root for him at moments in the film. So seeing that in that 10 minutes is really good.
Yeah, and we kind of get we do get that insight into Bruce Willis, but at the same time, Bruce Willis never becomes a sympathetic character, does he? And I think this might be the most villainous I've ever seen Bruce Willis. He doesn't really play bad guys. But he murders children in this film.
Yeah, I mean, that's when it really switches his character, because at the start, after seeing that montage, I was kind of rooting for older Bruce Willis to sort of fix his life, because you've seen his entire life pan out. You've seen him sort of almost have the happy ending, and then you know that his wife is killed. So you kind of want him to sort of fix all those problems, because what we've seen of younger Joe so far, there's not that much to his character yet. He's just going about being a looper, killing people, getting high, sleeping with hookers, and that's all we really see. We don't really see much to sort of put you on side with him at that point.
Yeah, and it's why that montage is so important, because it's 30 years of character development packed into 10 minutes. And yeah, I get what you mean. That's why you would automatically feel sympathy for Bruce Willis. He's lost his wife. I will just add in that he's lost his wife in 2074, where it's impossible to murder people because of the tracking technology. She is shot to death by the Gap men. Fair enough. Went to great pains to insist that you can't kill people in 2074, and that's why looping technology exists. But okay. But yeah, we understand his motivations, and yeah, you do feel sympathy for him, but then those motivations lead him to the conclusion that he has to kill this rainmaker, this gang leader from the future who's running the show, kill him as a kid. And he does that, I was going to say without remorse, but he does have remorse, doesn't he? He feels bad about it, but it's hard to stay sympathetic towards him, isn't it?
Yeah, because of those, the actions that he does after that are they're horrendous, what he's doing. He's killing little kids and it comes down to that whole that idea, if you could go back and kill Hitler, would you go and do that? If you could kill him as a baby before he's done all these horrendous things. And that's a question which we haven't really seen touched upon in a lot of the time travel films we've looked at. And in this, Bruce Willis is just yes, I would definitely do that because it impacts my life directly. And he's almost quite selfish in his actions in that as well. But his actions also show a free will with his time travel, because we've seen him live that life once and become older Joe. But then he has that moment where he's killed all the Gap men after they've killed his wife. And he's okay, so I'm going to go back in time and try and fix it. and change things. So you're seeing like a free will with time travel, which we don't always get. And I know in the other film we're going to look at, it's a different sort of side of the coin. What do you make of that, sort of like in this film?
Yeah, he's a time traveler who he's not bound by any idea of the rules of time travel or whatever the rules of time travel might be. He's not worried about protecting any timelines like some time travelers we've seen in other movies would be. He's happy to go back and kill baby Hitler. I would say, like in this example, he's killing baby Hitler for personal revenge, not the altruistic reasons of saving millions of lives. Like he's he is just on like a revenge quest to try and change the future and save his wife. Yeah, it did make me think of that question though. Would you go back in time and kill baby Hitler? And I guess it made me think, well, I was just glad that if that situation ever came about, I would not be the one asked to kill baby Hitler. I don't think I'm in a position where I'd ever have to do it. So I was just grateful that decision to kill a baby would be in some time travel authorities' hands, and it's not up to me. Maybe I'd kill him as a young adult before he came to power.
Watch him for a bit.
Yeah,
see if he's like a nasty piece of work there.
Well, he is a nasty piece of work.
I mean, but like in his teenage years, he might have been a bit nicer. I don't know. I never met Hitler.
Oh, I bet he was a fucking awful teenager.
Legend is the Rainmaker came out of nowhere. In the span of 6 months, took total control of the 5 major syndicates.
I'll take an army.
But he didn't have an army. The story is that he did it alone.
So we get old Joe and young Joe together, and they meet up in the diner. Bruce Willis reveals his arm, and it looks like he's got something carved into his arm. Be at, and you think, oh no, they've caught young Joe, but it just said Beatrix, because that's the name of the waitress. So they know to meet at the diner. What did you make of that scene? Because that was quite a famous scene when it came out, because they have the whole conversation about old and young Joe, time travel memories and stuff like that.
Well, I kept thinking of Back to the Future 2. I kept thinking of that moment when old Biff is talking to young Biff, and old Biff is just like, you're a dummy, you're stupid, like, you need to stop doing these things, you need to stop making all these jokes because they're not working and stuff like that. And in this, like, old Joe is just really ragging on young Joe, just calling him a kid, saying you don't know anything yet. This woman you're going to marry is so good, blah, blah. Like, you're going to have such a good life if you do this. And young Joe's just like, well, I'll just meet a different woman, it's fine.
Yeah, but that makes old Joe really mad. But I think young Joe is showing like some real intelligence and wisdom there, because his reasoning is like, if you want to save her, then change things now so that I will never meet her. It's your fault. You got her killed because you're a dirty scumbag like me. We both are. And if neither of us ever meet this lovely woman, well, she won't get sucked into our lives and she won't get killed in the future when it's impossible to kill someone. And she'll be safe from all of that. And old Joe, he just can't accept that. He's just like, well, he's still that kind of obstinate, grumpy guy, and he set out to do something and he doesn't respect this younger version of himself, and he just says, no, look, forget about it, you don't know what you're talking about, I'm doing this thing. Well,
he's had so many more years of being like a hitman as well. He's like become hardened from all of that stuff, and he finally finds the love of his life who sorts him out. So he's still got all of those years of being a big old bastard, hasn't he? So that's kind of like, it's still there.
He's a more advanced, he's turned his life around, but he's a more advanced version of this violent criminal Joe. He's just, like you said, got more experience of that world. So yeah, he's not willing to listen to reason. He's given himself a mission here, and he's really determined to see it through. There is that scene where he refuses to like engage with young Joe on a conversation about how time travel works. So young Joe's figured out, he understands the whole thing about wounding his body, and that's going to show up on old Joe. And he asks him about, well, what about the memories, how does that work? And I remember the first time I saw it being really mad at the reaction, which is Bruce Willis just goes, it doesn't matter. And he's like, I don't want to talk about it.
I don't want to make diagrams with straws.
Yeah. And I really felt like that was a sort of substitute audience question from young Joe and a substitute Rian Johnson response from old Joe saying, look, I'm not explaining it any better than that. Just forget about it. We're not having this conversation. And I do remember how annoyed I was the first time I saw that, because I felt like it was a legitimate audience question about how it all worked, and it was being fobbed off. I did notice watching it back that he then kind of immediately goes on to describe the experience of the memories reforming, which really reminded me of like frequency and the butterfly effect. That sounded basically like what old Joe is describing, that he is gaining new memories from his interactions with young Joe. It didn't happen the first time, but it has that immediate time cop rules effect on the brain. So butterfly effect rules.
Because my memories aren't really memories. They're just one possible eventuality now. And they grow clearer or cloudier as they become more or less likely.
So you've got this mirroring of Joe in old Joe and young Joe. So young Joe doesn't feel any of that like weight of the past life, and none of his memories ever change. So he just lives his life as he would anyway. Whereas old Joe is constantly having these new memories flooded in, and he's losing track of his past life. And there's one scene in particular when he's holding the locket with his wife's picture in, and he continuously is like saying her name, like, don't forget her, remember the first time we met, remember that moment. And he's trying to hold on to that memory. But if young Joe changes his present and subsequently changes old Joe's future, then it's all going to sort of like, it's all going to disappear, isn't it?
I guess so. And I guess what you can read from that is when he's clutching onto the pocket watch and trying to remember the first time he saw his wife's face, I guess what you can read into that is that events haven't changed enough yet that young Joe can't still meet her. But they're close to, the events are changing so much that timeline is close to no longer existing and his memories would be overwritten. Am I being too unemotional about it? Is it more about like the power of love and he's just like clinging to that memory of the woman he loves? Am I just trying to make it too cold?
I think that's what it's supposed to be. Like he is supposed to be sort of like feeling all of those emotions in that moment. But I suppose but by that point, you've seen him kill a kid, and like he was upset about doing it, but he still went and did it because he wanted to try and fix his future timeline. So that kind of it obviously takes you offside. And whilst all that's happening, you kind of become more aligned with young Joe anyway, because of what's going on in the farmhouse. And then you've got this whole other plot line going back to the TK stuff, the telekinetic sort of like side bit in the whole story. So you've got the whole stuff in the farmhouse where young Joe is sort of like meeting this young kid and his mum, and you're seeing him interact with them, and you're kind of like, you're aligning more towards him and that sort of part of the storyline then.
Yeah, he takes on a reluctant protector role. And that helps cast him as the hero of the story. You've got Bruce Willis, who is hunting down and murdering children, and Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who has gone to a farmhouse to protect an innocent child from Bruce Willis. So you're under no illusion about who the good guy and the bad guy are there. But young Joe's still very grouchy about it and crotchety. It's a bit of a kind of screwball comedy romance, like, the way he's thrown together with Emily Blunt, and he's like, I don't want to talk to you guys, I just want to hide in the crops and reluctantly protect you. And obviously there's kind of like a bit of romance going on there. Did that work for you? Were you sold on that, them being a couple?
Well, I kept thinking about how old Joe had met his wife, and his wife got him clean from his like drug habit. And that's exactly what Emily Blunt does in the first moment that she meets him. So they're kind of trying to sort of make it like, oh, maybe he'll end up with her instead.
Well, yeah, and isn't that the exact moment when old Joe is struggling to remember the first time he met his wife, because he's getting this conflicting memory of Emily Blunt helping young Joe get clean and recover from his wounds. I think that's happening simultaneously. So the implication is that there's a new woman in both of Joe's lives and in both of their memories that can potentially, if things go a certain way, replace the woman that he meets in Shanghai.
Yeah. And surely, like, if he's clean and off the drugs that early in his life, he's going to go on and have a better life from there.
Well, yeah, all of that could happen. And we don't really get any resolution on that. I guess we don't get resolution on that until the end. And I guess that's because at this point in the film, playing devil's advocate for the film, things could go either way at this point. We just don't know. And that's why old Joe's actions are still happening, I guess, because it's a real-time effect on him rather than a retroactive one. This is the stuff that doesn't quite make sense with the real-time damage on the older version of the people, because it has implications on their 30-year past up to that point, doesn't it?
They've got a lot of exposition in this as well, in terms of trying to explain bits and pieces, and just not necessarily the time travel, but in terms of sort of like what's going on with the characters and the characters' emotions and their character development, what will happen to them later down the line, all this kind of stuff. But I know this was marketed more as sort of like an action film. So do you think the action sequences work with this, like, this character-led story? Do they sort of merge in a nice way? Or would you have liked to have seen more action or less the character stuff? Or is there a sort of discrepancy between the two?
I don't know. I think it's all right. They are good action sequences. Like I said before, it's the quality of stuff like that that makes up for some of the other stuff that's lacking, the kind of logical inconsistencies that bothered me. There are good action sequences, and it does kind of feel like an action film. I don't know. How did you feel about it all tying together?
Yeah, I liked all the action stuff, and I liked the sort of like development of the characters. But the thing for me, when we talked about the butterfly effect, it felt like there was too much going on. And it felt like Rian Johnson had been writing different bits in his notepad for different films, and then went, okay, so I'm just going to put them all in one film. So with this, you've got like the dystopian society, you've got the time travel happening, you've got this sort of like mob group from the future, interacting with everyone, and then you've got this weird like TK Akira-esque, Omen-esque plot happening as well. So it felt like there was just a bit too much. If they just sort of like cut off the fat and kept it to one of those storyline or one of those story points, I think it would have worked a bit better for me. But I think the main thing which I sort of like wasn't 100% on board with was the Rainmaker plot, and sort of like having this young boy. So the young boy which young Joe is with in this farmhouse, turns out that he's going to become the Rainmaker. He is baby Hitler, this crazy, powerful, telekinetic child who, when he gets in a tantrum, bad things are going to happen. And I just felt like that was like quite an interesting bit of story, bit of plot point, but on top of all the time travel and the dystopian stuff, it didn't quite track.
Yeah, I agree. It causes big problems for the overall kind of structure of the film. It, like the second half, it's a film about telekinetic mutants in a society and how that's going to affect a future society, and that just doesn't like stack up with the time travel looper stuff from the first half of the film, especially rewatching it a second time, and you know it's going to be about the telekinetic stuff. You just see how forced that is in the first half, because when Joe first picks up Seth, he's floating a coin in his hand. So then Joe has to explain in narration that 10% of the population are telekinetic. But then he even goes as far as to say, but it doesn't really do anything, and basically people just float quarters. And you're like, well, like this shouldn't be in the story if all you can say about it is people have superpowers, but it doesn't do anything. So don't worry about it. We'll get back to that later. That's really bad storytelling, I think. And you could argue that it pays off because of what the second half of the film is, but like you said, it just feels like there's competing ideas going on in the film, and they don't mesh. And it feels like either two different films clashing, or like this could be many elements from a shared universe of films that would work well as individual stories, but Johnson is kind of ramming it all into one place, which doesn't work that well for me.
I will give him this though, like I quite like the world building in it in terms of the sci-fi look of stuff, and we talk about this all the time, sort of like when you sort of like sci-fi something up. So like the crop dusters and the guns in this, they make them very specific. They're like ordinary guns, but they've been sort of futurized. So you've got the blunderbuss, which is just a short range kind of shotgun. And then you've got the GATs, which are sort of like longer range, more accurate, supposedly. And they make a big thing about that as well, don't they? The fact that the blunderbuss doesn't shoot very far and the GAT will shoot further. And that becomes like the main bit at the end when young Joe is facing off against old Joe, and he realizes his gun won't be able to reach him, so he turns it in on himself.
Yeah, it set that. I like that as well. That sets up that nice tension for an action sequence. So he's got to use his blunderbuss in a creative way. It also it does work on that world building side as well, because it kind of says something about the types of people in this criminal organization. You've got the loopers who are just like, they are just there to pull a trigger at a certain time. And it implies that the GAT men are more sophisticated, kind of, a higher level of the criminal organization. That's all subverted. That you get that setup, but then that's all subverted by the relationship between Joe and Kid Blue, because Kid Blue's the main GAT man that we see in the film, and he's like a whiny, incompetent idiot. Whereas Joe, like you said, Joe's got the blunderbuss in that final fight with him, and he does something creative with it. You know, he's not just a trigger man; he's intelligent, and he wins the day because of that. I liked all that stuff. I even noticed there's lots of like little things in the film that kind of do that world building, like when Emily Blunt's escaping in her truck, you see the back of the truck and it's got like a pipe going around the back of it and into the side where the petrol cap would be. Yeah. So it kind of, I don't know what that's supposed to be, but it gives you an idea that maybe like petrol's not really a useful resource anymore, so the cars had to be retrofitted with some other technology, and the pipe's just there to, that's how you would use the fuel tank now. That doesn't need to be explained, but it adds to that dystopia where things aren't working the same way they do in 2020, for example, or 2012 when the film was made.
Yeah, they do sort of like, they drop things in earlier in the film and sort of go back to them later on. But there was one moment like that which really annoyed me. And again, it was to do with the Rainmaker. When they talk about, the Rainmaker supposedly has like an artificial jaw and he saw his mum die. So you're thinking all of this when you see Sid and his mum, and you're thinking, is this going to happen at some point? And then what's going to happen after that? So afterwards, I was thinking, okay, so he saw his mum die. He still has seen his mum die, hasn't he? Even though it wasn't really his mum. So he's still seen his aunt die earlier in the film, and he's still been shot in the face. So has any of the stuff that Joe done, has that affected anything at all?
Oh wow, I didn't think of that. Yeah, I thought that was just there for a red herring because they introduced the idea that he already had seen a mother die, but it was his fault, wasn't it? His original substitute mother, his aunt, he killed her, I think.
So all of the stuff still happened,
and Sid's a scary kid. Even with, so Emily Blunt's insisting that like, no, if I raise him, I can raise him right, he'll be a good boy, but he's a terrifying kid who shreds Jesse, the GAT man, to bits because of a tantrum.
Yeah, exactly. That scene, I did get flashes of the X-Men film where Jean Grey does that.
Oh yeah,
to someone. I kept thinking of that when she like takes Charles Xavier and then Magneto and then blows them up basically in one scene.
Yeah, like I said, it's all cool. It all looks good. It's like a good sci-fi film or good sci-fi scenes. It's just that telekinetic stuff just doesn't feel right in this time travel film. It feels like you, if you went to see it at the cinema, it feels like you paid for one film and you got half another film, and it wasn't what you were paying for on the way in. That's what's frustrating about it. You don't feel like you're getting the thing that you were sold.
Yeah, but it does have lots of like interesting elements. I still really love the whole bit where they're torturing that guy and they're sort of like all of that kind of stuff. And like we said, sort of like the stylistic elements. But in terms of plot, it has its holes and it kind of like, it trips up on itself a bit.
Yeah. So you mentioned that torturing again, and I said I wanted to come back to that because I do think it's important for the way the film ends. So what happens in the final showdown in the cornfield, and how does young Joe, finally save the day.
So young Joe realizes he can't reach old Joe with his blunderbuss. It won't go that far. So the only alternative he has is to turn it on himself, and he shoots himself and dies. And then as he does that, old Joe disappears.
So that's like self-sacrifice, and it's like, supposed to, wrap everything up in a neat bow. And he's decided, we get another bit of narration to try and force the exposition in a little bit more. Like who's young Joe talking to at that point? We don't know, because he dies a minute later. But he says he sees the path that's ahead of this boy, angry, lost his mum, telekinetic abilities. Old Joe's going to cause the Rainmaker to come to existence by his interference. So he sacrifices himself. What doesn't track in terms of the time travel stuff is that old Joe has explained about the experience of gaining new memories from being in the past with young Joe. He's going through that. That's what we've seen in Frequency and the Butterfly Effect. So he's gaining a new set of memories as he changes the timeline. Surely everything that young Joe's been through at that point in the film means that old Joe's memories should have been changed so significantly that, old Joe's life would have never happened anyway. Young Joe just having the realization that Sid's going to become the Rainmaker if he doesn't kill himself, that the realization alone should be enough to stop old Joe from ever going down this route, right? Because it forms a new memory in Joe's mind. This isn't a divergent timeline story. It's a Frequency Butterfly Effect story where the characters gain new memories. So do you see what I mean? That doesn't quite track. That I think just the realization itself should be enough that it would give old Joe new memories and he'd stop what he was doing, right?
Yeah, because at that point he will have changed his future by knowing that fact early on. So he's changed as a person in that present in 2044. So by being a different person at that time, knowing different things, he's taking that future knowledge and changing his path down the line. But he doesn't, he shoots himself.
Yeah, which is effective and it's more dramatically powerful. But again, I kind of feel like, because we've watched a lot of time travel films, I kind of feel like Rian Johnson wants to have his cake and eat it with the time travel rules. So there's two different ways of doing this. You could do the time cop rules, which allow you to have the cool torture scene with the real-time effects on the body. Or you can do divergent timelines where Bruce Willis's life always happened the way it happened, and him coming back creates an alternate reality, an alternate timeline. So Bruce Willis gets to stay Bruce Willis with all of his memories intact, and that would allow him to, he would go on to kill Sid and nothing young Joe did could stop him. It just kind of feels like Rian Johnson wants to have both of those scenarios so that he can have the cool torture scene, but also have a character who doesn't learn from his own experiences as a young man seeing himself murder a child.
Yeah, it's just taking too much on in one go, isn't it?
So instead, let's talk about a film that doesn't look quite as cool, but I think it thinks things through a bit more neatly. Let's move on to Timecrimes.
So Timecrimes from 2007, directed by Nacho Vigalondo. This was like his first big film, and it's quite unknown still, isn't it? Because I don't think we'd really heard about it until we sort of did some digging into time travel films for this series.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of it. I haven't heard of him either. What else has he directed since then?
So in 2016, he directed Colossal, which had Anne Hathaway in.
Oh.
And it was... Yeah, it's the film where Anne Hathaway is controlling a giant monster, like a kaiju kind of beast.
It's like a Godzilla film, but like a comedy version of that. Is that right? I really want to see that one.
Yeah, it's a weird one, because it goes into sort of like her life more than it does with the kaiju stuff. And that works, but it's got its issues. But it's still like an interesting watch. I would say it's like... It's got so much going on that it's worth having a look at.
Nice. Okay, I'll check that one out. But Timecrimes is the film we're looking at today, and Timecrimes is perfect fodder for me and for us, I guess. It's proper low budget, very, very simple, simply made, complexly written, which is something I always love to see in a sci-fi film.
And it really uses its time travel effectively in this. It knows the rules, it sort of states the rules fairly clearly, and the characters react to those rules throughout it. So it's all focused mainly around this guy called Hector, who has just moved into a new house with his wife. And he's a bit of a voyeur, isn't he, Matt?
Yeah, we're introduced to him he's sitting in his back garden in the first scene, and he's just a guy who owns a pair of binoculars and likes to use his binoculars. And he sees a woman getting naked in the woods, which, I don't know, on the one hand, fair enough. He's in his own property where he's got a pair of binoculars if she wants to get naked in the woods. But it's a little bit strange, isn't it?
Yeah, he's a bit of a peeping Tom, isn't he?
Yeah.
Like, he spots this woman in the woods getting her top off, and then his wife comes along and he's like, puts the binoculars away and is like, oh yeah, nothing here, blah, blah, you go. And then as soon as she's gone, he gets the binoculars out again to have another look.
Yeah, and I suppose what's important about him as a character is he's not just the kind of guy who will have a look with the binoculars. Because he's seen this girl in the woods, he then wants to go into the woods and investigate, which is his downfall, I guess, in the film. That he has to go and interfere and get involved with that situation, which goes pretty badly wrong for him.
Yeah, it does not go well for old Hector. So he's just far too curious, isn't he? So he sees this woman, he's like confused as to why she's getting naked in the woods, and he decides to go and sort of like have a look and find out what's going on. And he comes across this bike which has been just like left abandoned, and he goes into the woods, and then he sees this woman completely naked, like it looks like she's unconscious, laying on a rock.
Yeah, well, he takes a closer look and we see that she is breathing. She is alive. She looks quite serene, doesn't she, when he walks up to her, because she's sitting sort of perfectly in like a straight line. She's not like sprawled out like she's collapsed unconscious. She's been placed there, which we find out later she has been placed there, but she sort of looks almost like a doll the way she's placed there. And it really reminded me of like a Louis Buñuel film, because it's quite surreal, a naked woman positioned very carefully in the woods. It's a very strange psychosexual image that reminded me of something from a Buñuel film, which is then piled on even more, I think, because a man shows up out of nowhere with like a bandaged face and stabs Hector and starts chasing him. So it becomes even more surreal, but it gets more into the horror kind of feel of things, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I feel like the surreal element is something which I didn't properly take on board. But you're right, it's so surreal. And the fact that this bandaged man has pink bandages as well. They're not just like, they're a bit bloody, but they're pink. So it's this and like the way he's chasing after him it's almost comical, because there's certain moments. There's one moment in particular when Hector is looking through his binoculars, and then he sees the guy in the bandages turn around, and he's pretending like he's got binoculars, and it looks like ridiculous. Like, I laughed when I saw that moment. It didn't freak me out. I was just like, what is going on?
I thought it was quite scary.
Yeah, it didn't get me that bit. And there's another moment later on where this bandaged man, it jumps to be seen through a window. And there's like lots of bits like that where he seems a bit sort of bumbly. And I couldn't get over that when I was watching it. And then thinking about it from the surreal aspect, that kind of works a bit more for me, because the surreal ideas are creepy. And it's sort of like when you watch a David Lynch film, some of the dialogue is just ridiculous, but the surrealness of it is what creeps you out. So I think that's what is happening here with this.
Yeah, I think there's some Lynch in there as well, along with the Buñuel. And if you look at the film as a whole and look at Hector's day, or Hector's 2 or 3 hours that encompass the film, I think that altogether kind of is where the surrealism comes from, because we were just saying, like, he's just a guy who sits in his garden and likes to look with binoculars and see if he can see a naked lady. That's as much character development as Hector gets. And then he just has this incredibly stressful experience where he wanders into the woods and gets chased by a man in bandages. If you look at that whole picture without there's no context of character development, it's just this experience. The whole thing feels like a bad dream because there's no context. It's just this one crazy night that he has, and you don't know anything about it.
So we don't find out very much about Hector at the start of the film, but we're suddenly on this sort of like magical mystery adventure of time travel with him. And so he's being chased by this bandaged guy, and he's walking around. He goes back to his house at one point, then he decides to run away, and he ends up in this sort of like this weird science lab. It's not even a lab, it's like, it looks like an office or something at the start.
Yeah.
And then he hears someone on the radio saying who's there or something like that, and then he ends up following him into a proper laboratory.
I think it was supposed to look like more of a professional laboratory. I think it was more just that it was a really low budget film, because it does kind of look, well, amateurish, doesn't it? Like a lab that's been thrown together in an office that is used for other purposes, which I think is probably more down to how much money they had to create the lab, I guess. But yeah, he gets drawn into that. He doesn't know what's going on. He's not supposed to be in this lab, but he gets convinced to go up to like a silo at the top of the hill because that's going to be safer, because the man in the bandages is going to chase him. And that looks much more like you said, that's more sci-fi. It looks like a mad inventor's lab, doesn't it? The guy in there is wearing huge rubber gloves. I love the rubber gloves. And he convinces him to get into this pool of like milky water, which, you know, seemed like a very bad idea when that was happening, didn't it?
It's so suspect, isn't it? And the guy, so basically he ends up in this silo. The young man scientist says, okay, so get in this big pool of white goo, hide in there, because there's nowhere else to hide in this room. If you go in there, I'm going to go in there in a second. I just need to press this to close the top of it off. And obviously, he's not going to get in there with him. You know that from the start. And then, he just willingly goes in this weird machine. And then it's dark when he went in. And he wakes up and it's daytime. And it's like, what the hell's going on? And of course, we know it's time travel.
Yeah, and luckily we have a scientist character on hand who can say to Hector, it's time travel, and explain to him that he's gone back in time about an hour. But it's kind of strange because the scientist is being played as not understanding what's going on. He knows that he's standing in front of a time machine, but he's obviously not expecting Hector to come out of it because he's never turned it on before. So a man's coming from an hour in the future and he's like, oh, you must be a time traveler. And he's kind of got to react to that in real time. So they're both on the back foot in their understanding of what's happening. But now we have a second Hector, Hector 2. Is he Hector 2 or is he Hector 1? How do they differentiate? Right, okay. So he becomes Hector 2. And then what? He's just kind of supposed to... I think the scientist kind of has a bit of primer logic because he tells him to just keep out of trouble, just go upstairs, sit in a room and stay out of the way while the timeline gets back to normal. Yeah,
just hide away until the other Hector goes back in the time machine, and then it will all be fine because you would have tied up your time loop. There's nothing wrong there. Just go to sleep for a bit, stay somewhere safe. Of course, Hector, being the curious guy that he is, can't leave well enough alone and decides to go on his own little adventure, doesn't he? He steals a car and then goes out, and then he sees this woman who he's seen previously. And obviously in his head at the moment, he's been chased by this weird bandaged guy who looks like he was trying to rape this woman. So he's thinking, okay, I've got to try and save this woman. There's something I can do here. So he has good intentions at first, doesn't he?
Yeah, but it very quickly turns, again, quite surreal because Hector gets involved in a car accident and has to bandage up his face. And I think at that point, that's when he kind of clocks what's going on and who he is in the turn of events. But he seems very ready to accept that, and he stops trying to help the woman quite quickly, which I found Not strange, but just very interesting, that kind of middle portion of the film where Hector just very readily steps into the role of this terrifying bandaged killer Matt, doesn't he?
Yeah, because the scientist has already told him that he can't mess anything up in the timeline or else there will be two Hectors, and that can't happen because there can't be two Hectors, basically. You just can't have two of the same person. It won't work. So he's got this in his head, these sort of time travel rules that he has to make sure that things stay the way they were before. Obviously, he's already fucked that up by getting in the car and driving off for no real reason, just because he's a bit confused. And he's made the phone call already, so he rang himself when he was back in the office. So we had that whole moment. And then he sort of gets into this big car crash. And like you said, with the bandages, he takes the bandages which were on his arm, which he was stabbed in previously, and then starts putting them around his face, because he starts putting them on his head initially because he's got a big gash on his head. And then there's this weird bit where the white goo, which he was in previously, turns pink, which was quite cool, but also a bit surreal and weird.
Is that what it was? Wasn't it his blood doing that? Or is it not just, but is it not just like his blood is mixing with the white goo in the bandages? And
it's that mixture of the both is what turns them pink, which is what gives it that sort of like that crazy look.
Do you think there's a moment where Hector realizes what's happening and accepts that he's got to like step into a role to play?
Yeah, I think in that moment when he's bandaging himself up and he sees like, because he starts off slowly and he's like, I'm just going to bandage the top of my head. But then he's like, oh no, these are the pink bandages I saw previously. So at that point, he knows that he has to play this character. He knows that Hector 2 is the bandaged man he saw previously. So he is now the bandaged man.
Yeah, so we've got another predestination paradox, haven't we? Because at this point, all Hector is doing is just kind of reacting to events in the best way he can to try and make sure it happens the way it happened before. So he forces the woman to strip off in the woods while keeping an eye on his past self, knowing that his past self will see the woman, and that's how everything started off. So he's initially reluctant to go along with the scientist's suggestion, which is everything's got to play out as it did and you've got to stay out of things. But then he very quickly realizes he does agree with that, but staying out of things is not the answer. He needs to be very involved in things to make it happen.
Yeah, and then it goes into the whole bit, like you said, he's making the woman strip off. He's picking up that coat to sort of make himself look exactly like the bandaged man. He's doing all of these things because they've already happened. So he kind of has to do that. So it's kind of this idea of like determinism again, isn't it? Like, are things preordained? Is this the way things have to be? And then at that point, the film takes that outlook, doesn't it? It's like everything has to be exactly the same. So Hector 2 is doing everything in exactly the same way. Because if he doesn't, then Hector 1 won't end up in the silo and then won't go there at the right time, and then it will just all go to pieces.
Yeah, and it's going to go back and forth on that position of predeterminism, isn't it, throughout the film? It does come to a conclusion, and a very solid conclusion on where it stands on that, but particularly through Hector, his attitude towards determinism changes depending on whether he's Hector 1, Hector 2, or Hector 3, doesn't it?
Yeah, so initially he's like, I can do what I want, it'll be fine, when he's Hector 1. But then Hector 2 is taking this deterministic look.
But then we need to get to Hector 3.
Oh, Hector 3. So it's not just doubles, is it? It's triples in this film.
That really took me by surprise. I wasn't expecting that. I just thought there was going to be the two of them. But he gets back to the time travel lab and then he wants to go back through it one more time. But I guess we need to say why. It's because he's... Yeah,
because there's already been a few little things at this point which kind of like signify that there might be somebody else there. Like when Hector has the car crash, somebody has rear-ended him. You don't know who it was. You don't see the car. You just see the car crash. So at that point, you're kind of thinking, is there someone else here? But they're very subtle about it. And yeah, and then there's also the moment when he goes back to his house, which is sort of the big moment for why Hector wants to become Hector 3 in this film. because he goes back to his house. He is still chasing after the girl in the woods, and he hears music in the house. So he's like, he assumes that the girl in the woods has gone to his house to try and find some sort of like safety from the scary bandaged man, which is him. And then you've got this whole sort of like chase scene, haven't you, in the house?
Yeah. Why is Hector 2 chasing the girl at that point, though? What's he actually trying to get out of that?
I think it's more that he doesn't want her to go and tell the authorities about what's going on.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's something like that. They're very sort of like vague about that. For whatever reason, he wants to sort of like go and make sure that she's not causing trouble.
But it ends tragically. She falls off a roof, or he thinks that she falls off a roof, but when he looks down, it's his wife, Clara, with like a horrible neck's all twisted back, and she's dead. And that's what drives him to... He goes back to the lab, but he still does a little bit more predeterminism, because he has a little walkie-talkie conversation where he gives the scientist the information he needs to lure Hector to the lab in the first place, which we saw at the start of the film. To lure Hector 1, sorry. But then he himself goes back and he insists that he wants to go back again. He needs to save his wife. And that's when Hector's getting to... So Hector 2 is this predeterministic person who is doing all this horrible stuff to the woman in the woods because he just believes like, well, I just need things to play out how they are, and this isn't evil because it's predeterministic. I have to do this. But then he very quickly changes and says, no, I don't accept that. I must save my wife. I don't believe in predeterminism anymore. So he has that. He very quickly changes positions for an emotional reason. And
they sort of show this change in him as well, physically as well. So you've got Hector 1 who looks just like normal Hector. Then you've got Hector 2 who has the bandages. And then you've got Hector 3 who... his face is really beaten up because of all the things he's been through. His nose is a bit broken from the looks of it. His cheeks all swollen. He's got a big sort of like gash on his head. He's really been through the wars, hasn't he? So you've got 3 distinct looks, and also you've got all these different viewpoints on time travel. So Hector 3 is going for the viewpoint that he can change this. He can he can save his wife from falling off of that roof.
Yeah, so at that point in the film, how did you feel about what was going to be happening next and what was coming?
I think the film does such a good job of making sure that every sort of little thing that you pick up on is referenced later on. So there's always a reason for something. So it is predetermined. And sort of seeing all those bits made me think, okay, so there's no way that Hector can save his wife because it's all happened before. We're just seeing it from different viewpoints.
Yeah, absolutely. I felt the same way. I was very much on the determinism side of things because, I mean, the biggest thing is the car that runs Hector 2 off the road and causes him to become the pink bandaged man. Like we mentioned before, something's going on there. It's just like a random, it's not going to be a random incident. He gets run off the road by someone and you never see that car again or who did that. You kind of know like, well, I think we're going to come back to that and that's going to be Hector again. It works so well because it's a very short film. It's a very fast-paced film. There's no time to worry about that when it happens. You can log it in the back of your head and trust that they're going to come back to it. But in the moment, it just like rattles on with the story. But yeah, I was convinced that somehow Hector 3 was going to be the cause of his wife falling off the roof, and it was never actually Hector 2's fault. He lured her up there or something like that, and she was going to take the fall.
And that sort of like does come to pass in a way, doesn't it? So after he's rear shunted Hector 2, he gets himself in a car crash, and then the girl in the woods sort of wanders up. And then she says, we should go to this house. And then Hector ends up going to his own house before Hector 2. So Hector 3 is in the house with the girl in the woods. And then we see all of those scenes, which we saw with Hector 2, getting sort of like hit by the table, falling down the stairs, chasing after the woman. We see them from a different perspective. And we see Hector 3 finding his wife in the house as well.
Yeah, but he stows her away from harm, locks her in like a little coal shed or something. At this point in the film, it's probably the strongest sense of free will being an important factor, because you think, oh, right, okay, Hector's actually done something here to really intervene, and he's taken his wife out of the series of events so she can't fall off of the roof. And that's an interesting twist, it feels like. It feels like he's disrupted the timeline at that point, which throws up a whole load of other questions. Are things going to play out the same for Hector too? Is this going to cause like a some kind of paradox? But that's not what happens, is it? It kind of gets back on track and wraps it up.
Yeah, because all of that happens really quickly. So at that point, you're kind of like, you know something big's going to happen, but you can't quite work it out. My initial thought was that Clara, his wife, is just going to escape and then end up on top of the roof, and then it's all going to end terribly. That's just how it ends. But no, the film does a really clever thing. So what happens is Hector Free persuades the girl in the woods to go to the bedroom, and then he finds the pair of scissors, which have been such a sort of like important part of the film so far. So they're the same scissors which he's stabbed the first Hector with, and they've been sort of like around since the first moment in the film. So he uses those scissors to chop her hair, and by doing that, she has the same haircut as Clara. And he also makes her put on this red coat. And he explains to her that you've got to look different so that he doesn't know it's you. So he does all of that. And then it ends up with Hector 2 chasing after her. The same sequence of events happens again. But this time we know that the woman who falls off of the roof isn't Clara. It was the girl from the woods.
Yeah, she becomes a second double of this film. She's acting as a double for Clara, his wife. It's pretty horrible and it's very sad. She's just like this completely innocent girl who just tried to help a man who got in a car crash in the woods. And she's drawn into this complex time looping mystery where she ends up getting thrown off a roof and gets her neck snapped. It's horrible.
And they sort of like the double thing as well. There was one thing I noticed when I was watching the film. So, she's got a t-shirt on with two dogs. There's a red dog and a blue dog, and the blue dog is sort of upside down. So again, even with just like the motif of the film, and with that t-shirt in particular, it's sort of like setting up that reflection idea and the doubles. So her becoming a double at the end as well is so poignant, because they've been setting this up throughout the entire film. Like, there's lots of Hectors, but there's also like two Claras almost in this case.
Yeah, and Hector's kind of manipulated things to save his wife at the expense of this girl. What did you think about Hector in doing that? Do you think he's we talked about like how skilled people are at being time travelers when we talk about other films. Hector calls himself a failure when he's talking to the scientist on the phone, but he's kind of engineered events. Do you think he's a competent time traveler?
Well, in that final scene, he is doing things in a very sort of clockwork way. He knows the timings of things by then. He moves the ladder because he knows he needs the ladder there at that point. He sort of like grabs the scissors straight away. He isn't sort of like worried or anything like that. He's going through the motions. So I think by that point, by the time he's Hector free, he's lived this day twice already. He knows sort of like what to do, and he has become more competent by that point.
Yeah, I think he's a very intuitive time traveler. All that stuff that you just said about he knows how to act, that's that's Tom Cruise on loop 135 of Edge of Tomorrow, or Bill Murray on day 900 of Groundhog Day, but he's only on his third go around of events here. And, all we know of him is that he's a peeping Tom guy, sort of otherwise normal guy, no special abilities or anything like that, but he fits into this world very quickly and adapts very well. And even when he's describing himself as a failure on the phone to the scientist, that's kind of devious, isn't it? That's a ploy on his part, because he knows from previously experiencing events that the scientist takes that call and hears the heaviness of his voice and thinks that everything's just gone horribly wrong. But he's just kind of playing the part. I don't know if he's necessarily feeling that. He needs the scientist to hear that in his voice so that things will play out a certain way in that that version of events.
Yeah, and he references the fact that the scientist is going to get punched in the face by Hector too, and he wants that to happen. Like, he wants those events to happen as they did previously, so he can kind of get his revenge on him in a way.
Yeah, so it's interesting that just 3 loops in, he's already turned into this time-travelling puppet master like Bill Murray at the end of Groundhog Day.
But it's that sort of sad revelation that he's had in that final scene as well, which kind of explains how slow he is with his movements and, like, but purposeful, because he's kind of accepted that this is how things are supposed to be if he wants to save his wife, but he's still got to do this pretty horrendous thing in order for it to all work out. So what are the final sort of time crimes that Hector's committed then? So he's forcibly made this woman strip, and then he's knocked her unconscious. I don't know if you can class any of the stuff that he does to himself as crimes.
I don't think so. He stabs himself in the arm, and that's kind of the beginning of the violence for Hector, but he just does it to himself, doesn't he? But he ends up murdering this girl, or he's responsible for this girl's death, isn't he?
Yeah, and that's the big crime. And it's like all of these other things which have been happening in the film, like he's been a bit of a pervert, he's been a bit of a voyeur at the start, then he ends up sort of like stabbing someone. He's basically sort of assaulting this woman. All of these things sort of ramp up until that final murder scene. But he does it, but he's still sort of like, he's not doing it necessarily in a malicious way. It's just because he knows that these are the way things are supposed to pan out. So you don't, obviously it's a horrendous thing that happens at the end, but you don't feel like, oh my God, what a bastard necessarily. You kind of have, I had mixed feelings about Hector at that point, because he saved his wife, but he's also killed this woman, this poor woman who's had like just a terrible, terrible time of it.
I sort of get what you're saying. You're saying that he's not a time-traveling murderer, more just that he's a puppet of fate, I guess, and in a deterministic view of the universe, this woman was a victim of just the necessities of time travel, I guess.
It's a time travel tragedy story, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I kind of get what you mean, but Hector, there's something about the way Hector's portrayed and the performance that he slips into all of that a little bit too comfortably to be totally sympathetic to his situation as like a victim of time travel himself.
Yeah, because he definitely kind of plays the victim role, but you're right, he is sort of like, the stuff he does out of selfishness again. It's kind of like the selfishness that old Joe was doing in Looper. He's doing that because he wants his life, he wants to save his wife. And in this, it's the same thing. Hector wants to save his wife so that he can sort of like have the best outcome from this time travel scenario.
And he's capable of doing, both of them are capable of doing very monstrous things in order to see that outcome come to fruition.
So doubles aren't good then. They're never good.
No, and it just leads to tragedy and horrific events happening. And on that note, next week on the show, we will be joined by the master of horrific events, Mike Munzer.
The master of horrific events. We, of course, mean the master of horror podcasting. Michael Munzer, our good friend Michael Munzer, will be joining us on the show to talk about The Endless and Happy Death Day. So we're talking about Happy Death Day 2U as well, aren't we? We're covering a lot of films next week, aren't we?
Yeah, we will be covering Happy Death Day because we can't really talk about Happy Death Day 2U without talking about the first one. But the second one is much more on the time travel and the sci-fi side of things. So we'll be focusing on that one and The Endless, and we'll be covering Resolution as well, which is kind of the precursor to The Endless as well. So we've kind of got 4 films rammed into it.
So yes, there's going to be a jam-packed episode next week, so make sure you download the podcast episode for that one. In the meantime, if you want to get in contact with us, you can find us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We've got a website. If you look up @Through Sci-Fi Pod or @Through Sci-Fi, you should be able to find us. We've also got a lovely discussion group you could come and join up on Facebook. Search Journey Through Sci-Fi. You'll be able to find all of our network connections and come and join in with the fun.
So that's all for this week. Please do join us next time.